75-year-old grandmother came home from the hospital after hip surgery. She was accustomed to living alone, and she was very independent, so she made her family go home the next day. She was hobbling toward the kitchen to make lunch when she remembered her glasses on the nightstand, so she swiveled in the doorway to go back, and her foot, raised due to being on crutches, watch me injure myself, hit the door frame. And so her daughter had to drive her back to the hospital where the doctor set her broken ankle. Later that afternoon, she got back home. She remembered the trash collection was the next day, so she took out a small sack of trash along with her house key to the big metal barrel, hobbling with one broken ankle and on crutches, and opened the trash can and threw the trash in, but with it, she threw the key to the house. So she leaned over in to get the key to the house, leaned too far, broke a rib. Could not get out of the trash can, started calling for somebody to help her. A neighbor came and saw her hanging on the side of the trash can, got her out, drove her to the hospital because she had broken that rib. The hospital treated her for a cracked rib and said, "Ma'am, we're sorry, you are not going home. You are not going home. You're staying for observation," which apparently was code for don't let her break anything else. Now remember, I told you she was 75 and independent. At her funeral 26 years later, at the age of 101, her family was smiling and telling stories about the day her resourceful independence almost got the best of her. You ever had a day like that? You ever had a day like you one thing to the next, you should go from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, and it's some discouraging thing that happens to you, and it seems like you just wind up in the trash can at the end of the day. Lots of people do. And lots of people understand how discouragement feels. Young or old, sick or healthy, all of us have days that feel just like that. The problem comes when those days result in discouragement, because let me tell you, my friends, discouragement is deadly. It is destructive, and it is exactly the opposite of a living hope that we're talking about these weeks. Discouragement always precedes destruction. I can't find or think of anything that has been destroyed without having been discouraged first. No person has ever come up to me and said, "I am so encouraged about my marriage and my family that I'm going to get a divorce." Nobody has ever come up to me and said, "I'm so encouraged about my church family and love it so much, I'm going to quit attending." Nobody has ever come up to me and said, "I'm so encouraged about what my faith means to me, I'm going to start drinking and drugging and figure out life that way." Nobody has ever done that with me or you. But when discouragement is present, I couldn't count the times all those things have happened. When discouragement is present, you will have an absence of hope and the living hope. And I don't care who you are, it will happen to you. You take, for instance, one of the greatest names and greatest prophets of the Old Testament, Elijah. What a powerful man, and my favorite event in all the Old Testament. Not long ago on Facebook, as a part of the Love Your Bible program, I posted, what are your Mount Rushmore of Bible characters, and what is your Mount Rushmore of Bible events? And my Mount Rushmore of Bible events was creation was number one, and number two was the contest with the false prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. It's my second favorite story, and it's the story from which Elijah is best remembered. So Ahab summoned all the people of Israel and the prophets to Mount Carmel, and Elijah stood in front of them and said, "How much longer will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people were completely silent. Israel at that point was like a wet noodle with no backbone. Their loyalties were based totally on convenience rather than commitment. And so it's time to decide, Elijah says to the people. You're going to follow Baal or you're going to follow God? It's time for you to make up your mind. Elijah is drawing a line in the sand. Remember, Dante said the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in a period of moral crisis maintain their neutrality. Spiritually, you can't ride the fence forever. Or you may say it this way: the middle of the road is for yellow lines and dead armadillos. There's a time for everybody to choose whom they will serve. So here's a showdown, a sudden shootout between Yahweh and Baal, Elijah and the pagan prophets, the law of Moses and the religion of Jezebel. And on the surface, you would think Elijah was pretty outnumbered, as in there were 850 false prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel and Elijah, and nobody's defending him. He's asking the people to stand up for God, and nobody stood up yet. It's just him. It's just him. You would have thought Elijah was outnumbered, but you would have thought wrong, because the God of Elijah makes up for any numerical deficit. As Moses read for us this morning, if God be for us, who can be against us? And Elijah found that out. And so they prepared a test to see whose God could bring down fire and consume the altar. And they prepared a bull and placed it on the altar, and they called out the name of Baal. The prophets of Baal did until morning, until noontime, shouting, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no reply of any kind. And then they danced and hobbled around the altar they had made. And about noontime, Elijah began mocking them and said, "You're going to have to shout louder. Your God can't hear you. You're going to have to shout louder. Surely he is really a God." And they get more desperate. And Elijah says, perhaps he's daydreaming or something else. Or maybe he's away on a trip or is asleep or needs to be awakened. They had been at it for 9 hours, the text says. Not a spark, not a flicker, nothing. And so they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves. They became cutters with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. They raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice, until there was no sound and no reply and no response. No response. And so what's going to happen then? Elijah has the people pour tons of water, gallons and gallons of water on the sacrifice. And he called to the people, "Come over here." They all crowded around him as he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. And he took 12 stones, one to represent each of the tribes of Israel. And he used the stones to rebuild the altar in the name of the Lord. He dug a trench around the altar large enough to hold about 3 gallons. And he said, "O Lord, answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and you have brought me back to yourself." And immediately, 9 hours, nothing, the false prophets of Baal. Immediately the fire of heaven flashed down from heaven, burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, the dust, even licked up all the water in the trench. And when the people saw it, they fell face down on the Lord and cried, "The Lord, He is God. Yes, the Lord, He is God." What a time of joy, celebration, and victory that must have been for Elijah. You would think Elijah's on top of the world, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you? Yeah, I thought so. And so Jezebel hears about it, that wicked queen, and says, "May the God strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you just as you have killed them." Wow. And so Elijah went alone into the wilderness, traveling all day, and sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. You go from what I think is the most exciting scene in the Old Testament, defeating 850 to 1 odds against the false prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and then you run from one little old wicked woman. I said that one time in a sermon, and a guy came up after him and said, "I know exactly what he felt like." But here you go from what you would think is the elevation of emotions immediately to being crushed and despondent to the point of praying that he might die. "Take my life, Lord, I've had enough. Take my life." That, my friends, is what discouragement will do to you. And let me just say this. If that could happen to Elijah then, after what he had just witnessed, who among us might not be a victim of discouragement? Who among us might not be in the same position? Evidently, Elijah expected his victory at Mount Carmel to solve the problem permanently. But he wasn't ready for just how entrenched Jezebel's resistance would be, and so he sank into a deep and dark despair. My friends, discouragement is the express enemy of hope. Now, eventually, God re-energizes him through rest and food and comfort in His Holy Spirit, but he is a good example of what discouragement can do to you and how quickly it can do to you, no matter how spiritual you are. Because you see, discouragement is like a common virus. Everybody catches it at one time or another. No doctor has ever invented a vaccine that can prevent discouragement from entering your system. Discouragement happens. It's a fact of life. Have you felt discouraged at any time during the last year? If you said no, you need an immediate course in the commandments on lying. Discouragement is a common virus to it all, and it's not just a common virus that we must learn how to treat. It is a recurrent virus. You will catch it more than once. I wish, because I've had discouragement many, many times, even within this last week, I wish discouragement was like chicken pox. Get it once, done, it's over. But discouragement is not like that. It is a disease that repeats itself as often as you let it. It is a common virus. It is a recurrent virus. It's also highly contagious. You can catch it mostly from discouraging people. That's mostly where you catch it from. It's a common virus, it's a recurrent virus, and it is contagious. Most of us would never dream about spending a lot of time in a confined space with somebody who has been diagnosed with a serious virus. I think we've just been all through that, right? So most of us are pretty aware right now. The last thing do you remember a couple of years ago walking through a grocery store and somebody sneezed or coughed? And it was like the whole store. Discouragement is that contagious. There are some times when you see some people, and maybe you ought to go, whoo. They can be that contagiously discouraging. One of the most important books I ever read, it's in my top 3 or 4, was a book written in 1986 by Gordon MacDonald called Restoring Your Spiritual Passion. And he addressed 5 types of people that affect our spiritual vitality. The first group is very resourceful people. And they are people who ignite our passion for Christ and His kingdom. They are always resourceful to you. You feel encouraged, not discouraged whenever you're around them. You feel uplifted whenever you're around them. They give you information, or they give you prayer. They give you something. There's such a resource in your life. And he described a second group of people called VIPs, very important people. And they're the people who share our passion, and they're close friends and they're fellow workers who labor with us in the kingdom of God. And with VIPs, we may not spend a large amount of time trying to get along or debating over whose philosophy will prevail or determining who's in charge. We're just determined to get the job done, and they're very important to us. They work in our lives, or we work in their lives in ways that please God and serve the kingdom of God. And then there are very trainable people. There are some people that we do not connect with on a personal level for this reason or that, but they're trainable people. They can catch the passion, and they can go out and also share the passion with others. It may not necessarily be with you, but it will be with others. And then there's what he called the VNPs, the very nice people. They're people who enjoy our passion, but they don't really want to work. They love you, and they will tell you, hey man, you're the best. Hey, keep going, keep at it. But try asking them personally to take on a task, and they'll sort of mysteriously disappear. They want to give you their opinion, but not their time. They want to talk about the health of the church or the organization, but they're unwilling to do what it takes to make it healthier. And VNPs, they're nice people. They're nice people. They're not bad people. They're nice people. They'll clap and cheer, but they won't do anything to advance your cause, really. They're just VNPs, very nice people. And then he described a 5th category of people called VDPs. They are very draining people. They just absolutely sap our passion. And they have a way of elbowing their way in and rarely leaving. And they are not very self-aware. They're drawn like mosquitoes to any, like mosquitoes are drawn to blood, they're drawn to any group of healthy people because they're not experiencing health themselves, so they're really attracted to healthy people. A healthy cluster of people will lose its vitality and its passion if there are too many VDPs, too many draining people to sustain them. VDPs who are permitted to relentlessly drain leaders of their passion will create a climate where no one wants to serve as a leader. Now, that doesn't mean we don't love VDPs. We do. That doesn't mean we shouldn't serve VDPs. We do. That doesn't mean some can't become effective servants of Christ over time. They can. But it does mean they must not be allowed to dominate and drain your time or your organization. They cannot. So I watch, since I read that book in 1986, I watch who I hang out with. Honestly, I would fly across the country in one day and back to spend time with a very encouraging VRP. very resourceful. I've done it. I've done it before. To spend time with a very resourceful person, but not a very draining person. Too much time, very draining person, you become drained, and there's no way to avoid that. And when you become drained, discouragement sets in and hope walks out. Discouragement always has a cause. There was a story a few years ago in an editorial column in the New York Times magazine about a crew that was plucked out of the Sea of Japan. Dazed and clinging to the wreckage of their sunken ship. And authorities jailed them after asking them what caused your ship to sink, because every single man on the crew claimed that a cow falling out of the clear blue sky landed on their ship, smashed through the deck, and sank the vessel. And the officials said, okay, get the breathalyzers out. These men were clearly drunk. They threw them all in prison, charged them. Clearly they were drunk, and they just allowed the vessel to sink. And the sailors remained behind bars for several weeks until the Russian Air Force called, having heard about the story. And the Russians, as they would be wont to do, prefaced their remarks by saying, "We're not taking any responsibility for this, but," and then they informed the Japanese authorities that the crew of one of their large cargo planes had apparently stolen a cow that had been wandering around the edge of a Siberian airfield right before they took off. And so they had planned to take a cow back home. Nobody had rigged the plane to carry live cargo. In flight, the frightened cow started rampaging back and forth in the cargo hold, and they feared that he would cause the plane to crash. So to save themselves and the aircraft and the cargo, they opened the cargo door knowing they were out over sea and shoved the cow out at 30,000 feet over the Sea of Japan. And the boat never saw it coming. No, I don't suppose so. Would you, out on the water here in Southwest Florida on a beautiful, bright blue afternoon, be looking up in the sky worrying about a cow coming down to sink you? No. But it really did make the New York Times Magazine. Some say it's an urban legend. It's hard to prove one way or the other. And it's a great story, even if it is fiction. Sometimes discouraging circumstances just seem to drop out of nowhere. Most of the discouraging circumstances that I have had in my life, I never saw it coming. All discouragement that has parachuted into my life has come from one of three sources. Circumstances, we've all had that. Some set of circumstances come, maybe betrayal, maybe jealousy, maybe harm, maybe a threat. Circumstances come, stuff happens, unexpected bills, health problems, inflation. Eggs get to $8.50 a dozen. Circumstances. Other people. Somebody says something negative or does something hurtful or harmful, and our feelings get hurt. And maybe we don't deal with it. Maybe we don't say anything back. We just let it lie there and fester. Or myself. And usually, the truth is, my main source of discouragement is myself. When Elijah lost hope, he did what we often do when we lose hope. Deeply discouraged, he made things worse by doing 5 things in rapid succession, all of them destructive. He started making rash, unhealthy decisions. He ran from responsibility. He blamed other people. I'm the only one that's left standing, Lord. He completely lost his perspective, and he gave up too soon. Sound familiar to anybody in here? That's what discouragement will do to you. And it is the exact opposite of the living hope that God has for us. I wish that Elijah and me were exceptions to that rule, but I know we're not. How do you deal with discouragement? Do you recognize its danger? Now, chances are mighty slim that a cow will drop out of the sky anytime soon on you. Although some of you, undoubtedly knowing your mindset, will be looking up every now and then just to make sure. But chances are very good that the other circumstances in life or other people, or maybe even yourself, will deliver you some discouragement. I'll close by reminding you, discouragement is very, very destructive. I've watched, and I could stand here and tell you through years of ministry stories, I could stand here and tell you many stories of discouragement shattering a person's career. I've watched discouragement destroy and shatter a person's family, marriage, or relationship with their children. I've seen discouragement. I've heard of one this week, been counseling on the phone with one this week, where discouragement has destroyed an entire church. When the spirit of encouragement in that church became a spirit of discouragement, and the whole church is threatened. John Toole was a young man who wrote a book shortly after he got out of the army. Since John thought his work had some promise, he shopped it around to various publishers and got nothing but rejection notices. My first book that I wrote, I sent 4 different publishers and got 3 rejections. He sent it around and got rejection after rejection after rejection, but he kept going because he had a dream to be a writer. But he sent in a second and a third book. They also got rejected. And finally, he just gave up on his dream. But his mom never did. She kept shopping the book around. She went from publisher to publisher, having no better luck than her son, until one day she read that an author was becoming a professor at Loyola University in New Orleans. And he had put out a book, and he was going to be doing a book signing in New Orleans. So she went to the book signing. And she said, since you're a writer, I've got a book that I'd like to just share with you, and you can keep it and do with it whatever you would like. He agreed to read the manuscript. He sold it to LSU, Louisiana State University Press. Nobody knew that the manuscript would turn into a bestseller on 12 different lists and stay on the bestseller list for more than 3 years. And then in 1981, John Toole's book, A Confederacy of Dunces, won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, the highest award possible. Unfortunately, he couldn't accept the award. The mother accepted it for him. But not for any happy reason. You see, when John Toole gave up on his dream in 1969, 12 years before he won the Pulitzer posthumously, He not only gave up on his dream, he gave up on his life. Stung by multiple rejections and discouragements, he took his own life a dozen years before his work would surpass his wildest imagination, the Pulitzer Prize. Discouragement always precedes destruction. And discouragement is a killer. It will wreck your life. It will wreck your relationships. It is contagious. It is extremely communicable. And it is deadly. But there is an antidote. Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, "We now have this light shining in our hearts, while we ourselves are like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure." The musical group Jars of Clay gets their name from that verse. This makes it clear that our great power is from God, not from ourselves. We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but not knocked out. That's what one translation actually says. We get knocked down, but not knocked out. But we are not destroyed. Through suffering, our bodies continue to share in the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be seen in our bodies. You want to know how you overcome the danger of discouragement and the destruction that it can cause? You remember this. I want you to read these two verses aloud with me, verses 8 and 9, and I want you to incorporate them in your brain and plant them on your heart and in your soul, because here is how you overcome the danger of discouragement like Paul was feeling. Read with me, please. We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not... No, wait a minute. Let's start over. Let's read the first half of each verse in a low voice. And then let's read the second faith-filled half with more power and strength in our voice. Okay? Here we go. We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. That, my friends, is a living hope. That's what we're talking about in this series.